Ah, mm. Welcome to... It's not a bad cold open.
No, it's not.
Welcome to The Empire Never Ended with Boris, Fritz, and Ray.
Yo.
Okay.
We're still all mobbed up here on the show.
We certainly are.
Yes.
And we've saved... it's kind of a surprise ending for the arc, in a way.
It is.
I would never have suspected that this is where we would end it.
It's a surprising, generally, occurrence in the world.
Yeah.
Who would think that there is such a connection?
Don't reveal the connection yet. Although, I think some listeners were also, at least one was asking about this connection earlier. Way early in the arc, I think.
You don't think they will figure it out from the title?
The description.
You want to hide it?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know how that shit works.
People don't read.
Yeah, I just assume that people get a notification that there's an episode and then they're like, oh, I'll listen to it. Without reading what it's about, which is not what I do. I always read descriptions to see whether I'm interested in it or not. But, you know.
Well, for those of us who don't value our time and just let YouTube tell us what to do, you never know how somebody ended up here.
Get that algorithm shit going.
Yeah. Oh, man, working here with y'all has really done a number on my algorithm. I'll say that.
Oh, my God, yes.
It doesn't make any sense. There's no pattern whatsoever.
I mean,
I feel like I've seen everything that I've been recommended at this point.
I get some very odd suggestions, especially after our music episodes, because that's pretty YouTube heavy for us.
That completely fucks it up. Yeah.
Oh my God. Then I just get like Thompson nonstop.
Yep. And getting some pretty shitty recommendations.
and worse. But, you know. I balance it out with the things that I actually like to watch on YouTube, which, you know.
Well, here's what I think, though. Every time
it's weird enough that, like, just my algorithm's completely insane.
I think what happens on mine is that when I do, like, re-enter normal society and type in a search key that is, not connected to our show, it overwhelms me with topics about that thing. I think it's just waiting, waiting for me to be more relatable as a consumer.
Yeah.
It's all backed up.
Indeed. I gotta say, this episode didn't actually help.
Or just there, maybe just no products for the stuff we normally see.
Not yet. Not till we get our shit together.
Yeah.
And you wait.
Maybe not products, but like, I don't know. We watch all those weird, like, Balkan interview shows, which are a form of consumer media in that they are, mainstream media. Interviews with different underworld figures / former state security people on Serbian television promoted by the state, or, that horrible Croatian Ustasha podcast and the other things that we use for research.
Yeah.
That's a product, I think.
Speaking of products, let's get on with this one. We got some story to sell here.
There is some product being moved in this episode.
Yes.
But, I want to take things back. I mean, today's episode is once again talking about another type of Black Hand.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
We've had, this one's considerably different than the others. So we've had the Serbian Black Hand, the original one. Serbian National Defense, which Ray has argued is a continuation of the original Serbian Black Hand under a different name.
Yeah.
We talked about the Westies connection to the Italian Mafia, which is also the Black Hand.
Yeah.
Via the Gambinos and whatever. And now we'll explore another odd Balkan connection to the Mexican Black Hand, aka La M, or, the notorious prison gang known as the Mexican Mafia. which also uses a black hand as its symbol. A lot of like old school Mexican Mafia guys have like black hand tattoos with, EME, big M's, and that kind of stuff. So in many ways, there are some similarities to the story of Boško Radonjić and the Westies in that somehow a guy of Balkan origin became the head of a different ethnicity's gang.
Yeah.
But the political circumstances of the Mexican Mafia's connection to émigré activities is, let's say, a little bit more murky than Boško Radonjić's very open connection as a member of SOPA. And then, the Westies thing kind of fell into his hands and he just became a gangster after that. They definitely do have in common this propensity for really, really extreme violence. Really extreme violence. Although the Mexican Mafia is on another level and it proved to be way more versatile in that, it still exists today, which, the Westies don't. And it still exists in a major way, both in and outside of prisons, as well as on the streets with different Sureños gangs and the like. So I guess I should probably mention who I'm talking about and how a Croatian guy became the head of the biggest Mexican American prison gang.
It's a theme.
It is. Oh, but again, this is next level. I mean, Boško Radonjić did take it on another level in that he got majorly into the cocaine business and made tons of money and had all these different state connections later on. But the guy that I'm talking about today is this none other than the infamous Joe Pegleg Morgan. Although anything that you read about the Mexican Mafia, they will say that you could never call him Pegleg to his face.
Yes.
Because you would get fucking murdered.
Yeah.
and he was fucking no joke. Absolutely no joke. But yeah, Joe Morgan doesn't really sound like a Croatian guy's name. It kind of reminds me of that Croatian communist guy, Steve Nelson,
Right.
Yeah. It just had a completely anglicized name. So Joe Morgan was born in San Pedro, California, LA, in 1929 as Joe Medjugorje.
Medjugorje.
Right? Medjugorje comes up again.
All right. The holy site that it, supposedly is.
Indeed.
The cash cow that it definitely is.
He could relate to that aspect of it. I'm not sure that the Catholic faith was a particular importance to him, given the amount of murder that he was doing. But
sure, yeah,
who knows?
The Catholic Church.
We'll get to that. We'll get to
yeah. I bet he's got some distant relative there driving like a BMW taxi, around the town.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, his original last name means somebody from Medjugorje, no?
Yeah.
And his parents were immigrants from Herzegovina.
Mm-hmm.
The story goes that his father anglicized their name to Morgan when he was a kid, although he died when Joe was very young.
I just realized then, if you count Pegleg as the middle name, his name is J.P. Morgan.
Well, okay, so I was about to get to that. No, he did retain his mother's maiden name as his middle name, which is Radišić.
Ah, okay.
So I've seen newspaper articles that called him Joe Radišić Morgan. So that was clearly still in his name. And so his dad died at a young age, and he grew up with his mom who moved from San Pedro to the Boyle Heights area of Los Angeles. And although both San Pedro and Boyle Heights were ethnically mixed at the time, and San Pedro especially is a huge center of Yugo immigrants, Joe Morgan grew up kind of particularly immersed in Chicano culture and around Mexican Americans, and as a result spoke fluent Spanish, and considered that to be his culture. I mean, in some of these stories that you read about him, they're like, if he may have not been Mexican American, but if you called him a white boy, he'd stab you, that kind of thing.
All right.
And so there's a lot of unverifiable stories about his youth, that he joined this and that gang, that he was in the Maravilla, like early street gangs in the 40s. But to say that he was, let's say, a troublemaker as a kid would be a pretty big understatement. So at age 16, he shacked up with a much older woman, Elvira Rojo, who was 30 or 32 at the time, depending on the source. And she allegedly contracted him to murder her husband, 52-year-old Jose Rojo, and murder him he did. And he beat him to death with a hammer and dumped his body in the Malibu Hills. So this is when he was 16 years old.
Damn.
This case obviously made a lot of headlines at the time. Young Joe was quickly arrested. I mean, they found the body. He didn't really take that much effort to conceal it. He literally, I think, wrapped it in a carpet and threw it off a cliff somewhere in the Malibu Hills. So yeah, he was quickly arrested, although he was able to escape county lockup before he was sentenced, like immediately within days of being locked up, through some kind of conniving. I've read some different accounts of the story, but basically he pretended to be his cellmate who was being transferred to a juvenile facility, got in the car, got in the police van, and managed to escape. And he remained on the run for a few weeks before the cops caught up to him, at which point, while running from the cops, they shot him in the leg, which got infected and gangrenous, and they had to amputate his leg, at which point, of course, he would wear a prosthetic limb for the rest of his life. Hence the name Peg Leg that, I guess, the prison authorities gave to him. Because, like I said, anything that you read about it, nobody called him that to his face. So his 30
just interjection. When he talked about rolling him up in the carpet and tossing him off the side there, I remember when I was in high school, we had these cops come in now and then to talk about law and order or like their jobs or whatever, or try to recruit kids or something like that. And I remember this one dude came in and he was like a county cop, and he told us we were just straight up asked him. The first question anybody wanted to know was like, "Did you ever see a dead body?" And the guy was like, "Oh, well, let me tell you, out there at the lake, we got what we call burrito people. We just unwrapping those stinky fuckers all the time, He said it's the burrito people. It's horrible.
Christ,
there's a word for them. People wrapped up in a rug and tossed into the lake. Ugh.
Yeah.
Fuck Texas.
Yeah. Well, this is Southern California, and I'm sure those cops were probably no different. In fact, so his lover, Elvira, was found guilty of second-degree murder, and the DA urged for clemency in Joe's case because of his age, obviously, and that they said that he was led astray by, and I kid you not, the ancient power of women over men.
Wow. Yeah. Nice.
I saw this in a newspaper article from
he was bewitched.
From the time. Yes. I mean, obviously there are some kind of fucked up consent issues.
Yeah, but it's not so much a gender thing. Yeah. It's more, she was twice his age, he was a teenager.
Yeah. An ancient gender.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm surprised they didn't mention that, she was like a Mexican or like a Latino.
Yes.
Latina or something.
Ancient Mexican witchcraft.
Yeah, I'm surprised too, because this is, after all, the late 40s.
La Bruja.
Yeah.
So because he had already escaped from holding, even though like he did get off relatively easy in that he didn't get life, he was sentenced to adult prison, which he served in Folsom Prison. And he was there for 9 years before getting paroled in 1955. But, of course, he went back to prison as fast as he was released, basically, within the same year, this time for robbing a bank, and then was sent to maximum security in San Quentin.
Without the involvement of feminine witchcraft.
No feminine witchcraft this time. Although, there were headlines, because he was already famous for, beating a guy to death with a hammer at age 16.
Yeah.
So when he went back to prison, it was, again, making the headlines. Oh, this guy came out. And so, yeah, he went to maximum security this time. But, his reputation in prison kind of continued to grow over time. He did a lot of high-profile acts in the early 60s, I think 1961. He helped orchestrate one of the largest prison breaks in California prison history at the time, leading 11 guys to escape prison. Apparently, they had hid all this lock-picking equipment and tunnel-digging equipment inside of his prosthetic leg. The guards weren't checking that. And so, he managed to get out. Of course,
Chekhov's prosthetic.
Again, they were also apprehended and, whatever.
Wasn't he apprehended like in the same town or something? Like he sort of hung around, was the story that I heard.
I'm not sure because he actually, he goes in and out of prison for his entire life. He spends a majority of his life in prison, which, surprise, surprise, is why, he became leader of a prison gang.
Yeah.
But the Mexican Mafia itself traces its origins to the juvenile penal system in California, mostly with some very young inmates like Luis Huero Buff Flores and Rodolfo Cheyenne Cadena. They're kind of attributed for starting the Mexican Mafia.
Another win for the carceral state.
Yeah. Well, both of them were, underage at the time. I think Rodolfo Cadena had stabbed another gang member to death when he was 16. And they started it as a way of kind of uniting Latino prisoners who were serving time. But it quickly developed as these members eventually were transferred to other prisons, to adult prisons, most notably San Quentin, but some others. But importantly for our story, it was in San Quentin that Rodolfo Cheyenne Cadena met Joe Morgan. And since he was a lot older than them and had spent a considerable portion of his life already behind bars, he served as some sort of kind of parent, teacher, mentor figure to a lot of these young Mexican Mafia guys. It actually kind of reminds me a lot of how that old school Croatian gangster Anton Lucic served as a member to Jimmy Coonan from the Westies. Although, of course, that was outside of prison. And, Anton Lucic contracted Jimmy Coonan to do his dirty work, whereas Morgan was definitely a lot more hands-on with the violence than Lucic. I mean, that's he was also in prison. He was, proving himself constantly. It's kind of hard to say how many murders Joe Morgan has under his belt, because there's a lot attributed to him. But it definitely kind of reminds me of that kind of relationship, right? Because both Lucic and Morgan were kind of older, experienced, and wanted to transform kind of really violent guys into a serious criminal organization. And that's exactly what Joe Morgan was doing with these guys from the Mexican Mafia. So he was made an official carnal or brother in 1969 and was given the nickname Cocoliso, which is a reference to his bald head. Because, the funny thing about him is that, if you look at pictures of him, he definitely had that kind of, Fu Manchu kind of mustache.
Yeah.
That a lot of Chicano dudes were rocking at the time, bald. Yeah. He could pass as Mexican, I guess, did a lot, except that he was extremely tall. In all the pictures, especially I think compared to Rodolfo Cadena, who was very, very short. He was twice his height, and in a lot of pictures you see of La M dudes, he stands out because he's much bigger than everyone.
Unlike Sopo guys, he didn't try to look more Mexican by wearing a sombrero.
He did. I have a picture of him. I have a picture of him in a full, he's wearing it's not a sombrero, but it's a cowboy hat, and he has the kind of Pancho Villa bandolier around him, and he's holding a rifle.
All in.
I mean, he, by all accounts, considered himself to be Mexican. He spoke Spanish with everybody. He apparently even learned Nahuatl.
Word.
That they used as code language in prison.
Yeah.
So he was in it to win it, and nobody really considered him to be a Croatian guy.
Yeah, the only Croatian fighting for Aslan, you know.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, so like at the point that he was made like an official member, brother, whatever, he was twice the age of the rest of these guys. So 1969, he's 40. The rest of them are like in their 20s. So you can kind of see what kind of relationship they had and why he was able to kind of become the leader of the gang in a lot of ways. Because like in the early days, the Mexican Mafia didn't have a really strict hierarchy. You had to be like approved by like all the members, and there weren't that many of them at the time. And, you know, they had like some sort of voting system, which I guess doesn't really exist anymore. But like, you know, he was older, way more experienced, and had connections that they couldn't really even dream of, right? Because he had been in prison for a long time. He had served time with all kinds of people. He had been an adult like San Quentin and Folsom for like his whole life, right? Even when he was a kid. So like he knows the system better than anyone, basically. And so that allowed Mexican Mafia to really develop into this really formidable and violent force. Of course, they had their own rivalries with other Latin gangs like Nuestra Familia from Northern California, but then eventually also in the later 60s with black gangs like the Black Guerrilla Family, which kind of led to one of the other things that Morgan is famous for, and that's his kind of diplomatic ability, in that he was able to like negotiate deals with all kinds of different gangs. And Nuestra Familia had an alliance with Black Guerrilla Family. Black Guerrilla Family, of course, started off as kind of a Black Power, communist-inspired gang, like in the like mid 60s. So Joe Morgan developed a loose alliance with the Aryan Brotherhood.
Yeah.
And of course, there are tons of stories of really like extreme violence that was going on at the time. A lot of the most notorious prison violence of, especially in California in the 60s and 70s, involved the Mexican Mafia. There were the famous shoe wars between Mexican Mafia and Nuestra Familia. I think we can talk about that a little bit more in the Patreon episode this week. But also like these, you know, massive like riots happening in the 70s where, you know, dozens of people would be killed. A lot of that attributed to the Mexican Mafia, and a lot of that, of course, attributed to Morgan, like because of his, you know, like ruthlessness and willing to get motherfuckers to, you know, be killed. But also at the same time being able to sit down with people and develop links. Like, for example, the links that he developed with the Italian Mafia from the LA crime family and also the Gambinos. He served time with a bunch of Italian mobsters in the 60s. There are guys that are mentioned like Mike Rizzi. And this would kind of help them a lot when some of them started to get out of prison. Because like
So the Gambinos were connected with both the Croatian-led Mexican Mafia and the Serbian-led Irish gang.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which is great to me.
Yeah.
I love it. Yeah, I mean they did business with everyone, but yeah, the Irish gang and the Mexican Mafia were being led by Yugo guys, which is ridiculous. Although I think that the Westies relationship with the Gambinos and in general with Italian Mafia members started a little bit later, right? That's the later 70s and the 80s, whereas this is like the early 70s, like late 60s or early 70s.
Okay.
Although, of course, Joe Morgan like was still basically running the Mexican Mafia until he died in 93. So, like, you know, yeah. I wonder actually what he knew about Boško Radonjić and like Westies guys, or if he knew anything at all, because that's a whole different, you know, world. That's New York mob / you know, whatever crime scene, and this is like, you know, LA. He was very deeply attached to, you know, LA, Southern California. But yeah, I mean, so these connections proved to be very important when he got out. So he was paroled in 1971, and he gets out, and some other Mexican Mafia guys are already outside now, and they start getting deep into the heroin trade. They have connections with both the Italian mob and now with like Mexican cartels in Mexico where they're importing really cheap heroin and, of course, everything else, weed, amphetamines, whatever. They're bringing it all in and at a very, cheap price. So like the Italians are selling it, everybody's selling Mexican heroin that they're getting through, Mexican Mafia guys. Mm-hmm. Kind of led by Joe Morgan. Although, of course, like I don't want to attribute everything to him because there are actually a lot of other people involved. And like I said, it wasn't such a strict hierarchy, but like he's the one that is considered to be the guy that really allowed them to branch out into other spheres of organized crime, like Aryan Brotherhood, biker gangs, and like cartels and the Italians. So, I mean, he had his bases covered there.
Yeah.
So to make a long story short, at least for the purposes of this episode, Morgan was indicted on federal drug charges while on parole in like the mid-70s, like 75, and managed to stay on the run for a few years before he was apprehended in Utah in 1977. And he would spend the rest of his life in prison. He died in 1993 of, I think, liver cancer when he was at age 63. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, though, he also managed to marry another woman whose husband he had murdered.
Okay.
There's a little
type.
Theme here.
He likes women whose husband he's murdered.
Yeah. And they seem to like him, I guess. I don't know. I don't know what kind of people he's finding out there.
I'm going to guess they weren't happy marriages.
Yeah, probably.
No, I guess not.
They say no happy marriage ever ends in divorce or hiring a hitman to kill one.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean, we'll get into some more of the shit associated with him, I think, on Patreon this week, like some of the later stuff, like 80s and 90s. But when he died, he died with this reputation as like one of the hardest gangster like dudes of that time period. Ruthless, took no shit, but was still able to like make lots of money and help make the Mexican Mafia into what it is today. Mm-hmm. And what it's been since then, which is like a huge criminal enterprise. That runs all kinds of stuff, especially in Southern California, but of course also in other places like in Texas and the Southwest. And this isn't like I know that I'm kind of glossing over a lot of the Mexican Mafia's history, but that's kind of not exactly the reason why we're here today.
Yeah.
And that's like, what's the connection to Joe Morgan and the Mexican Mafia to the rest of this arc, other than just being an interesting guy from the Yugo diaspora? And there's a thing that comes up a lot when you read about Joe Pegleg Morgan, like on Wikipedia, but also on various other corners of the internet, that connects him to, of course, Ustashas, because we had to go there.
Oh yeah. What are we going to do?
And I'll quote something now from his wiki.
Okay.
It is believed that Morgan offered Croatian political refugees such as Andrija Artuković protection from Yugoslav agents in the nation. Los Angeles was one of the few cities Croatians could openly oppose the communist government without any of the local leadership being murdered like in Chicago or New York City. Citation needed. It is believed Morgan used his gang ties to intimidate or even murder state agents sent to kill their political rivals. It's even been suggested that Morgan had family ties to Artuković, as both he and Morgan's fathers came from the same village of Klobuk in Bosnia.
Huh.
And then again, citation needed. Citation needing being the very important part here.
Yeah.
Because this is obviously something that piqued my interest.
Yes, it feels like bait.
So Andrija Artuković is the same important like Ustasha leader that Kalaja claimed to have tried to murder him. And failed.
I think I'll just give a quick bio of Artuković too, because I mean, I don't know. So first of all, like I said, this is all citation needed stuff on Wikipedia, and then I looked it up, and I keep finding more or less the same stories, but with no actual evidence to back it up.
Okay.
So I think what I wanted to do is that I spent a long time trying to find these connections, and I want to do some, I think, myth busting for the purposes of this episode.
All right.
To see at least if I can't get concrete evidence that this is true, at least we can make an informed decision on the probability of it being true or not.
Yeah.
But before we do that, I think that, like Ray said, Artuković is like a very important guy. He's probably the most important Ustasha émigré that we haven't talked about yet, really, in this arc at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like we talked about Luburić, we talked about Pavlić, we talked about all, these Ustasha émigrés, except for Artuković. I know we've mentioned him a couple times.
Yeah, he's been around.
He's been around, but like
period and all that.
But like we don't really, what's his deal? Who is he? So he was born in the village of Klobuk in 1899. Also, this is the same region that like Luburić is from. Or like a lot of these
something in the water
from. And he was one of the key members, very important members of the early Ustasha movement. Even like as a student, he was a member of like Frankist ultranationalist circles, Croatian ultranationalist circles. He got a PhD in law and is known for being one of the organizers of something that we've talked about before, the failed Velebit uprising. I don't know if we need to put background on that, but
it's a failed attempt of Ustasha insurrection in the monarchist Yugoslavia in the 30s.
Yeah. Then, of course, he was in like the Ustasha exile groups with Pavlić and the like in Italy. He was even deported back to Yugoslavia before the war for his involvement with the assassination of King Alexander. Pretty important guy, right? Pretty good credentials there for an Ustasha on the get-go. More so than Luburić did, at least before the war. So when the war starts, World War II starts, he is appointed first to be Minister of Justice of the Ustasha state, and then later to be Minister of the Interior. Which means that, he did a lot of the most instrumental legal stuff in the genocide of Jews, Serbs, and Roma in the independent state of Croatia. Like he signed all these, racial laws and decrees, pretty much anything you can imagine on the state level in terms of orchestration of, authorizing camps, authorizing the execution of, entire towns and villages. He did that.
Yeah.
And, to the point that like it's, we'll see later on, it's kind of absurd to even deny that he did that. I mean, there's like photographs of him, welcoming Hitler to Croatia, like all kinds of really, really horrible things. Like less hands-on than somebody like Luburić, who was actually administering camps, but on the kind of legal end of things, he was the guy doing most of that. I think later, at the very end of the war, he was some sort of like Secretary of State or, some position like that. But, occupied major cabinet positions throughout the entire Ustasha regime. So, of course, once the Ustasha government falls, he does what we've gone over so many times in this arc. He flees first to Austria, then to Switzerland. His connections in the Catholic Church put him in bouncing around a bunch of different Catholic monasteries for like the first couple years after the war. He tries unsuccessfully to get some sort of diplomatic passport in Switzerland, fails. The Catholic Church sets him up with a connection in Ireland.
It's very nice of them.
Where he goes and gets fake documents under the name Alois Anić. Which, he takes a fake name but uses his same initials, which is...
So he can remember.
Yeah, which is kind of funny. And he goes to the U.S., I think in 1948, under a tourist visa with this fake identity. So the U.S. is kind of an interesting choice for such a high-ranking Ustasha at the time. The U.S. was taking lots of Ustashas, as we've talked about many, many times, but rarely any of the ones that were that high up in the government. Most of them tended to go to Spain, Argentina, et cetera, et cetera. But he actually had a pretty good reason for wanting to go to the U.S., and that's that he had a lot of family there, including his brother. Interestingly, his brother, Ivan Artuković, or John Artuković, had left, had emigrated to the United States in, I think, like 1919 or like 1920 or thereabouts. First going to Western Pennsylvania and then joining his cousins out in California. But what's interesting is that he is one of the guys. Remember early on in the arc, we talked about when World War II started, the FBI investigated a bunch of Ustashas in the U.S. and the Ustasha network within the U.S., and then kind of a lot of them had to lay low and kind of got taken over by the Catholic Church for a little bit. So his brother was one of these guys that was investigated by the FBI at the beginning of World War II, and that's exactly when he decided to move to California and join his cousins in the construction business. So Artuković, shows up to the U.S. under tourist visa, goes straight to L.A., and overstays his visa. He eventually gets discovered, not only discovered that, he entered the country illegally, but discovered that he is in fact this, fugitive Andrija Artuković. The Yugoslav government subsequently discovers that he's in the U.S. in the early 50s and immediately demands his extradition. But the 50s being the 50s meant that all he had to do basically was tell the U.S. government that he is a victim of communist persecution.
Yeah, buddy.
That if he were to be extradited, that he wouldn't receive a fair trial, that the communists have something out. They're out to get him because he said that Tito is a Serb and that he is always fought for the rights of Croats against greater Serbian hegemony.
Mm-hmm.
And so using that and then his connections within the Catholic Church, which he had many, apparently as soon as he got to LA, he hit it off really well with this guy named Catholic priest in the LA Archdiocese named Robert Ross. It's a little Bob Ross guy.
Yeah, Bob Ross.
Who is, some sort of anti-communist Catholic priest who, vouched on his behalf.
I want to paint these adorable little mushroom clouds.
I'm going to paint a U with a cross over it.
I'm going to make a happy little B-25 dropping friendly little green berets into the wasteland.
No, that's not a swastika.
No, that is a sonen rod. It's still relaxing.
It is, yeah. But it turns out that so his brother and his cousins had set up a very successful construction business in LA. They were getting government contracts to build pipes and canals and all that kind of stuff in LA, $1 million contracts in the 50s, lots and lots of money. So he actually had pretty solid base, to operate on there and had pretty good lawyers. His lawyers in the 50s argued that the extradition treaty, that they can't extradite him because the United States had first signed an extradition treaty with the Kingdom of Serbia, and once the Kingdom of Serbia ceased to exist, they never renewed the treaty, and so therefore they couldn't extradite him. And then, of course, all this anti-communist mumbo-jumbo kind of got him off the hook for a little bit. I mean, he got arrested once in the 50s, basically for using a fake name and coming to the U.S. legally, but then they let him off the hook after that for quite some time. And it started to become more and more of a problem in later on, especially in the 60s and 70s, because it turns out he was the highest ranking Nazi or Nazi collaborator to seek shelter in the U.S., right? He was the minister of fucking police in, a Nazi puppet state. America took a lot of Nazis, but not ones that were that high ranking. So it started to become an even bigger problem. Jewish groups started to get involved. There's some interesting stories, a young member of the Jewish Defense League that, is a hardcore.
Yeah, those guys didn't fuck around.
Right-wing Jewish, paramilitary organization.
They were all up in your face. It was
they're
the ones that threw eggs at William Luther Pierce, which you got to give credit for that.
Right.
I mean, that was
they did more than that. This dude firebombed Andrija Artuković and his brother's car.
Wow.
And had to go and went to prison for it.
Word.
So there was a lot of pressure ramping up for his extradition, and it became a huge legal process. There's a lot of legal documents about this, and it was covered a lot in U.S. media at the time. But he wasn't actually extradited until 1986, at which point he was old as shit. His son was trying to argue the whole time that now he's senile, he doesn't know, it's not fair to take him back to that, unjust communist trial, whatever. And so, I think he was finally detained in 84, extradited in 86, tried and convicted in Yugoslav court, found guilty of, genocide and a lot of other things, and then died in prison in 88. Pretty. I think, how old was he then? Like 90 something. When did I say he was born? 1899. And he died in 1988. So yeah. The question is then, what was Artuković or any of these guys sheltered by Joe Morgan / the Mexican Mafia? And it's an interesting question, right?
It is an interesting question now that you bring it up.
So, like, one thing that sticks out to me in that, at least in the wiki, is that it says Los Angeles was one of the few cities where Croatians could openly oppose the communist government without any of the local leadership being murdered, like in Chicago and New York City. That's not really true. I mean, these guys operated with complete impunity in like a lot of cities all over the United States and didn't have their members, assassinated by UDBA. Moreover, I don't think UDBA could have assassinated Artuković because he was so high profile and because like there was an ongoing judicial process to have him extradited. Like, they were killing guys who were way lower ranking than that, right?
Yeah, and mostly in Europe. Am I wrong?
Yeah, but I mean, there were guys killed in Chicago, in New York, and all over, in Canada as well. But moreover, this idea that UDBA agents weren't operating in Chicago is weird to me because I'm wondering where this then comes from. Again, citation.
Wait, Chicago or L.A.?
L.A., sorry.
Yeah.
Because if you ask a lot of radical Croats, they would say that all of the bad things that happened in LA, because there was a lot of activity of course, we have to go back to it, the Croatian National Resistance.
Okay.
And Luburić's crew, they were quite active in the United States and especially in LA in the 70s. They were conducting bombings, extortion rackets. They murdered a Croatian guy who wasn't part of the Ustasha movement in Glendale, California in the 70s. 2 of Croatian National Resistance members were accidentally killed when trying to deliver bombs to a location in LA. They burned down the Yugoslav Cultural Center, or firebombed the Yugoslav Cultural Center in San Pedro. And of course, when you ask any of the Croatian community there, they would say, oh no, that was all UDBA. So either it was UDBA, which no, it was Croatian National Resistance. But, I'm wondering where this narrative comes from then. So it's somebody who clearly doesn't believe that the bombings and attacks that Croatian radical groups were doing in LA were UDBA, but then what do they actually believe was happening? Because, again, it's not like these guys were uniquely protected. But there's a couple things that I think lend themselves to the idea that there was maybe some sort of connection to at least Joe Morgan or organized crime in general.
Boris finds a way to work fucking Andrija Artuković into a story about the Mexican Mafia.
I didn't. Somebody on the internet did. And I'm very curious where they got it from. I've looked long and hard. So I think in order to talk about some of these connections that may or may not exist, I think we should talk really quickly about San Pedro, which is, the kind of port area of Los Angeles, one of the municipalities of Los Angeles. And San Pedro is one of the oldest and biggest Croatian communities and Yugoslav communities, but specifically Croatian communities in California and the West Coast. And it's, we talked about San Pedro a little bit at the beginning of the arc. It's where Louis Adamić, the anti-fascist Slovene American
writer, Congress guy,
also Congress, wrote the famous book Dynamite: A History of Class Violence in the U.S. Et cetera, et cetera.
Which is still in print, I think.
It is. In fact, I think there's a new edition that just came out.
Yeah,
nice.
He grew up there when they moved to the U.S. That's where he moved. Also, in those first couple episodes, I mentioned that L.A. was one of the big centers for raising money for the partisans and sending money to, for the All-Slavic Congress and for assisting the Yugoslav part of the American diaspora. And indeed, they have this old Yugoslav club, which, Ustasha's firebombed in the 70s, which, was founded in the 20s. And it was very much that kind of place until after World War II.
Right. Which was the entire
like
point
a lot
of the first part
like a lot
arc.
of places.
Yeah.
Right.
It wasn't always like this.
It wasn't always like this. I mean, there were more kind of right-wing Croats and stuff, but after World War II, a huge number of Ustashas specifically moved to San Pedro, also sometimes following, extended family that might be there and the like, but it's a big Croatian center, a lot of people went there. And so the Ustasha émigrés there started their own Croatian club that's specifically Croatian and anti-communist and all this other stuff that's, just a few blocks away from the Yugoslav club, which after the war in the 90s was renamed to the Dalmatian American Club. But yeah, a lot of the immigrants there were from Dalmatia. They were sailors, dock workers, fishermen.
Makes sense. Yeah.
A lot of Americans know of Star-Kissed Tuna.
Of course.
That company was started originally by a Croatian guy from San Pedro. His first name escapes me. His last name is Bogdanović. So, it became a place in the 50s and 60s that had a lot of activity, right? Fights between the different sides. The more right-wing Croats started their own soccer team called Sports Club Croatia. There was also a Sports Club Yugoslavia. They would have games against each other in which there'd be soccer riots in California, which is kind of funny to think about. But importantly, for trying to establish some sort of connection between somebody like Joe Morgan, who is also from San Pedro, and somebody like Artuković, who lived in San Pedro. Well, actually, he lived in Long Beach, but the rest of his family, it's all there. It's all more or less kind of the same area. The San Pedro is kind of the cultural center that they all gravitated towards, a lot of Croats in LA. So to understand this link between organized crime and how it might be related to Joe Morgan, and if we're going to think about this myth that we're trying to bust or not, see how probable it is, there is an argument to be made that connection could have been deeper than anybody's written about, due to the fact that a lot of those Croats, like I said, were involved in fishing and in the shipping industry and in the port there, which, as we know from the Westies story, was kind of the Yugos into organized crime there, which is all the dock workers bringing in contraband from outside, right? Working with the unions to manipulate things. So basically that they can, bring in whatever the fuck they want through the ports. It's a very important thing for any organized crime.
Right.
And from what I've read about organized crime in LA in the 20s and 30s, the Croats there were connected to the Italian mob in LA, and particularly around their activity in the ports. So it's not so unlikely that Joe Morgan, as a Croatian guy from San Pedro who has connections to both the Croats and the Italian mob, would then have decent relationship with, mobbed up Croatian guys.
Yeah.
Mobbed up Croatian guys, mobbed up anybody tends to be kind of anti-communist, right? And so those guys were probably more of the people who would be likely to want to protect somebody like Andrija Artuković. So I think that's one argument in favor of this idea that there could have been a connection.
I mean, the other thing is possible deep state CIA stuff. I mean, which is connected to the anti-communist stuff, but also to the cocaine business stuff. So, I mean...
Yeah, absolutely. And, I've read in some of these kind of communist era Yugoslav sources about Artuković at the time. They allege that he may have had a relationship with the CIA, which, is one of the reasons that maybe he didn't get extradited until much, much later. Of course, again, there are stories that when Croats in San Pedro were saying that UDBA was responsible for all these bombings and the like, that the FBI, and that they accused the FBI of providing information to the Yugoslav secret services.
So same like SOPO,
yeah. The FBI categorically denied that, of course.
Yeah. SOPO also publicly said, basically, in their memoirs that they worked with the CIA, but that the FBI was connected with UDBA.
Right. That's almost exactly the argument that these guys are making.
Yeah. Interesting.
So yeah, there is possibly that deep state connection too, although that could be more or less related to Joe Morgan. I don't think that Joe Morgan was meeting with CIA cocaine traffickers and shit. I don't think, he was mostly working within he was in prison for most of the time that we're talking about.
Yeah, right.
He was out of prison from 71 to 77, and the rest of his life is more or less in prison. So he's making deals probably with people that he knows. There's an argument to be made then also about Artuković, the Artuković family's relationship to the building trades.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, they were making tons of money in these big federal contracts for, building like canals and all these sewer systems or whatever in LA. Building trades also notoriously connected to the Italian mob, both on the West Coast and the East Coast. So that also could be potentially a link. Because, I don't want to understate some of the stuff that Mexican Mafia was doing with the Italians. They later kind of surpassed the Italians in that, they started selling so much heroin that they didn't need them anymore. But early on, they were running scams with the Italians for, all kinds of crazy shit. They were scamming federally funded drug rehabilitation clinics and skimming money from it and also selling heroin there.
Whoa.
All kinds of, really shady shit going on.
Yeah.
And then, of course, one of the other more direct connections could be that we know from, if we recall back to the Croatian National Resistance episodes, all the major RICO case against the Otpor guys in the U.S. directly involved a lot of mafia figures. And so this is this connection between the radical Ustasha émigré community and the mob, the Italian mob, specifically Cosa Nostra, for contract killings. Of course, a lot of that's in Chicago, but then a lot of those guys from Chicago moved to LA, right? And they moved to LA in the 70s, and that's when they start their bombing campaign. That's when they're murdering people, extorting people, all this other stuff. It's way more than likely that those connections carried on from Chicago to LA, right? And that Joe Morgan could have easily been one of those intermediaries, one of the people that was setting that stuff up. That seems pretty probable to me. So that's another argument in favor of that connection. So I think we have three arguments so far: dock workers, building trades, Croatian National Resistance's relationship to, Ustasha terrorist émigré organizations. And then, of course, I don't know, there's one other random thing I thought about, and I'm not sure how big of a connection can be made here. But do you remember that Miro Barisic said that when he went to prison in for the hijackings and the bombings or whatever, that black prisoners, specifically black nationalist prisoners, were really hostile to him as a Croat because they said that he was a Nazi.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a stretch, but Joe Morgan did develop an alliance with the Aryan brother.
Well, yeah, specifically against
the Black Guerrilla family.
Yeah.
Right. That could be, a marriage of convenience, or, some sort of, just coincidence, whatever, Black Guerrilla family linked up with Nuestra Familia. That was their primary enemy. And so Black Guerrilla family also by default became their enemy. Although, from what I understand, Joe Morgan was very much against making any kind of concessions to Black Guerrilla family and was keeping that beef going for a long time. It's a little bit of a stretch, but it's absolutely possible.
Yeah.
That by the 70s, especially because the thing is, we don't know anything about Joe Morgan's politics. A lot of people have written and talked about Joe Morgan, but strictly from the perspective of the Mexican Mafia, this intriguing detail that this, tall white guy became the leader of Chicano gang, and that was super well respected, and whatever. But we literally know nothing about his family and his connections to his family, his Croatian family, his Croatian extended family in California, and whether he felt any kind of allegiance to that. Because if you believe this wiki and all that other shit they write on the internet about this, then Joe Morgan's father comes from the same town as Artuković, and so that's some sort of connection that they have. And, the way that these guys operate, that wouldn't be so surprising to me.
Right, yeah.
That he would be let's look out for him. That's, that's family. That's, whatever, meaningful in the old country kind of thing. But on the other hand, we just don't know.
Yeah.
We have no idea. I've tried very hard to find some sort of statements from Joe Morgan about anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because he died in 93, right? So
he died in 93, yeah.
So the war was going on in Croatia. It was a time to say something if you're a Croatian nationalist.
Yeah, but he didn't. And, maybe, again, maybe he wasn't a Croatian nationalist and he did these things out of either a sense of obligation to his family or just for business purposes.
Yeah.
Croatian National Resistance guys weren't, buying guns at the gun store. They weren't buying bombs,
Sure.
They were buying that shit from someone.
Yeah,
they were connected to the Italian mob. They were in, LA and San Pedro specifically, in which the Italian mob has connections with Croatian organized crime going back to the 1920s.
Yeah.
It's not a big stretch to say that maybe all of that is connected and Joe Morgan was somehow involved with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It wouldn't hurt to have Aryan Brotherhood friends too if you're interested in buying things like weapons.
Or yeah, I mean, if you live in anywhere in LA, it's great to have fucking Mexican Mafia connections. I mean, that's as good a protection as anybody would want. I mean, San Pedro has a lot of Mexican American population. You know what I mean? That's where he grew up. He grew up there in Boyle Heights, in which there were both Yugoslavs and Mexican Americans. And so if you're in that world, that's the protection that you want, I guess maybe via the Italian Mafia.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to say this myth is not busted.
Okay.
I'd say that there's a reasonable probability of it being true, but unfortunately, I think it's impossible for us to make a definitive conclusion here as to whether or not Joe Morgan and the Mexican Mafia, whether or not, Artuković had, Mexican Mafia bodyguards or something, dudes watching his house or something like that. Which it seems to be what this implies, that Udba wouldn't dare step into San Pedro because they'd get lit up by
dude, imagine
Mexican Mafia guys.
That as a 90s film, as a 90s action film. That would be so badass.
It would be, absolutely. I don't know how true it is. Or it's definitely possible. I mean, I don't know, weirder things have happened, right? I mean, it is weird that a Croatian guy became Cocoliso and one of the heads of the Mexican Mafia. On the other hand, in LA, Chicano gangs also have alliances with non-Chicano or Latin gangs, right? Famously, Armenian Power, also from LA, is allied with Mexican Mafia and Sureños, right? So, and Armenian Power people also have connections to different Armenian revolutionary movements and whatever, and this, that, and the other thing. They're Armenian nationalists and the like. So that kind of thing wouldn't necessarily surprise me, right? Do you guys remember that video from early in the Syrian war of the Armenian Sureños in Syria?
Mm-mm.
No? For real? Oh man, that's one of my favorite. Well, favorite. It's an insane thing from early in the Syrian war. This video surfaced.
Catch myself.
Of these two guys somewhere in Syria, face tattoos, all tatted up, speaking Spanglish, waving AKs around, and representing Sureños and Southern California, and that they're from Armenian Power. Which is a major gang in Glendale and that part of LA. And they were, grew up in LA and were deported back to Syria, where there's, a large Armenian population for, being in gang activity. They weren't citizens or whatever. They were deported right in time for the Syrian war to start.
Hey, we're still right here, homie. It's fucking morning. We got the enemigos right there, homie. Let me represent myself, homie. It's Creeper, homie, from the G-Dub 13 gang, homie. Son Valley gang, homie. Fucking Weiner from Westside Armenian Power gang, homie. Still puro Sureños putting it right down, here, homie. And Middle East, homie, in Syria, still gangbanging, not giving a fuck, homie. Look, homie, check this shit out. The puro Sur 13, homie, still gangbanging this shit, homie. Got the G-Dub, homie. Come, homie. Check out the enemigos right there, homie. They're all right there, dog. But we don't give a fuck, homie. As you know, homie. And shout out, homie, Capone, Mr. Criminal from Silver Lake, homie, Capone from Cyclones, and Crazy Loco from Pasadena, and Pink Lady. We still got love for you, girl. We still got love for all your homies, all the sureños, all you vatos. Let's put this shit down to all these motherfuckers, homies.
God damn.
Wow.
But they're like Armenian dudes in Syria. I think both of them died in some Armenian militia that was fighting with Hezbollah on the Syrian government side. Like, I think they died in like 2016 or something. But like that kind of connection also makes me think, like, okay, maybe it's not so far fetched, right? Like,
yeah, of course,
that like Sureños, Mexican Mafia dudes could have like a decent relationship with like Ustasha terrorists.
Yeah. Sure.
You know what I mean? Like,
a lot of interests, crossover there.
It's all about business.
Yeah.
They share a territory.
Right.
I'm sure that, like, you know, shit's coming in through the ports in San Pedro, that like some Croat guys are working there, and, you know.
Sure. Yeah.
All the fucking tons of heroin that was coming in and everything else. I mean, it's not a stretch. So yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think? Yes, no, maybe?
I mean, for sure, it's plausible. Like, why not? I mean, there was, we have a Serbian guy who's the head of the Westies, so why not this? I mean,
yeah, and he wasn't even Catholic, right? This is even more likely.
Yeah. I mean, it's the Cold War, you know, everything is possible.
Mm-hmm. That was the mood of the Cold War, as I recall.
Yes.
Everything's possible.
Yes.
I mean, you want all of these connections. We know that, you know, the mob is connected with all kinds of right-wing CIA-connected stuff.
Yeah.
And this is a group that is connected with the Gambinos and has a boss who is of Croatian origin. I mean, so why not?
Why not?
And the Gambinos or other Italian mob have connections with Ustashas directly.
Yeah.
I mean, there was this, I don't know, I was reading this one researcher who was talking about like how Croatian paramilitaries armed themselves in the 90s. And she mentioned the connection between like Cosa Nostra in the US and Ustasha émigrés. And also the provisional IRA. But
okay.
But yeah, Ustasha émigrés and the Cosa Nostra. So again, seems very plausible to me.
For sure. For sure.
I don't know, maybe we should hit up Chris Novoselic from Nirvana. He's a Croat from San Pedro.
There
he can tell us what it was like back in the day.
We haven't brought up him.
That's before his time.
You know, be our big celebrity get.
Did we mention him before?
We did. We did indeed.
Yeah.
A couple times, in fact, and how, in general, very disappointed we are in how he turned out. Yes. That's our official take.
Well, he could drop some knowledge on us of San Pedro.
Yeah, probably a lot of other weird shit. Well, yeah. Anyway, we're almost done here. This is a weird way to end it. I love it. And we're gonna power on through this topic with the Patriot episode. We're gonna watch a film together. Always a nice way to close out. You know, a long.
Then a wrap up next week, and then a kind of a inter-arc period.
Oh, it's wild. I love them. Liminal spaces. And there's your anything can happen. That's the Cold War.
Yeah, I mean, inter-arc is anything can happen.
Fucked up things will happen in the inter-arc period. I guarantee that.
Well, it's good.
And then we're going back to American Nazis.
USA!
Yay!
That's right. Yeah. Good.
It's been a long, strange arc.
Yes.
It has indeed.
Yes.
I didn't think at the beginning that we were going to end with Sureños and Mexican Mafia and all that kind of stuff.
Here's the challenge for our listeners, though, is to find us some Tamboritsin narco corridos. Ooh. That's what we need here.
Yeah, clearly. I'm kind of disappointed that Joe Morgan doesn't have his own corrido. Looked it up, but...
Yeah. Well, maybe he has some tamboritza.
Doesn't seem likely. But
no, it's not.
I don't know.
Does not. Well,
you can't have everything.
That's right. But you can have more episodes of The Empire Never Ended because we just keep coming. We just keep making them. We're still here.
Keep coming at you.
Dropping weirdness. All right, boys. See you later.
All right. Later.
Bye.
Bye.
Ya se ha salido ese preso, más listo que una pantera. Lleva por nombre Lorenzo y le dicen mano negra. vida, sea por el amor de Dios. Lo sentenciaron a muerte porque mató a 32. La tropa lo persiguió, haciéndole una emboscada. El diablo lo protegió, no le podían hacer nada. Arriba el norte, pasando por San Guayo. Con la pistola